We were eating dinner when my granny asked, "How are you feeling after the anonymous text about you being too ugly to live?" I froze. I had been getting anonymously bullied online ever since I was 11. Most of the time I'd screenshot every text and send it to my dad and granny, but I kept that one a secret. "How do you know about that?" I asked. She tried to laugh and said she was getting mixed up, but I kept pressing her. My dad slowly turned around as the color drained from her face. "Show me your phone, Mom." "This is ridiculous," she said, but her hands were trembling. "I'm trying to help. I've always been trying to help." Dad grabbed the phone from her hands. She lunged for it, but he was already unlocking it with the passcode. "What the F?" he breathed, scrolling through each anonymous text she'd sent. Turns out it had been her all along. "Your face makes me want to vomit," Dad read aloud, his voice shaking. "Everyone at school thinks you're pathetic." He scrolled further, his face growing paler. "Your dead mom would be ashamed of what a slut you became." The words hit me like a physical blow. My biological mother had died of cancer when I was 8. Tears started streaming down my face. "Keep reading," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Read the one from last week." Dad's finger moved across the screen. "Your boyfriend showed me your nudes. Your body is disgusting. He told me he only has intimacy with you with the lights off." His voice broke. "Mom, you sent this while we were at dinner, while you were sitting next to her." "There's more," I said, sobbing now. "Tell him about the one where you said you were pregnant with Charles's baby." Dad found it, his hands trembling. "I'm pregnant with his baby. He's leaving you for me. He says you give terrible head anyway." He had to stop gripping the counter. "You sent this the night she came home crying about Charles breaking up with her. You made us tea. You said boys were stupid." She held me while I cried. I choked out. "Look at the Instagram, Dad. The Snapchat. The anonymous school app. She has 7 different accounts." Dad was scrolling frantically now, his breathing getting heavier. "No wonder your mom killed herself. Imagine having you as a daughter." He slammed the phone on the counter. "Her mother died of cancer." "I know exactly what her mother died of," Granny said coldly. "You held my hand at the funeral," I screamed, standing up on shaking legs. "You said she'd be proud." "Keep scrolling, Dad. Read the ones about you." His finger hesitated over the screen. "Your dad touches you at night, everyone knows. That's why you're so messed up. Daddy's little slut." He had to sit down, his legs giving out. "You sent this while I was on a business trip, while you were supposed to be taking care of her. Remember when I started showering at 3 a.m.? I asked him through tears. "Remember when I stopped hugging you? She convinced me that I smelled like fish, that people could tell. I was 14, Dad." Dad was still scrolling, finding more horror with every swipe. "End yourself." He looked up at his mother, tears in his eyes. "You knew she'd attempted. You drove her to the hospital." 3 times, I corrected, my whole body shaking. "I tried to die 3 times, and every time she was there with tissues and tea, asking who could be so cruel." I laughed through my tears, but it came out broken. "The weight loss," Dad said suddenly, pieces clicking together. "You said kids at school were calling her fat." "I went from 125 pounds to 87, I whispered. "She made me special meals while texting that nobody wants to see my flat ass." My voice broke completely. Dad found something else on the phone that made him stand up. "You documented her breakdowns?" Granny finally spoke, her voice steady. "Of course I did. Look how unstable she is. I needed evidence." "Evidence of what?" Dad shouted. "Evidence of the torture you put her through?" "I lost everything," I said, collapsing back into the chair. "Juliet's mom won't let her near me. She thinks I sell substances because of your messages. My entire friend group. They think I fake drama for attention because you told them the bullying wasn't real. I ate lunch alone in the bathroom for 6 months. Charles," I continued, fresh tears falling. "I loved him, Dad. He was the first boy who made me feel beautiful after everything. She told his mom I was pregnant. She destroyed the only good thing I had." "The colleges?" Dad said suddenly. "Her scholarship to state." "Check her email," I said, my voice hollow. "She submitted withdrawal letters to every college that accepted me." His face went white. "You sent messages during her therapy appointments, while you were in the waiting room. And you never suspected. Too busy with your precious daddy-daughter bond to notice. 8 years of watching him drop everything for you, your activities, your problems. 8 years of—" "Get out," Dad interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "This is my house too," she replied. "Not anymore." He was already dialing 911. "Police? I need to report 2 years of cyberstalking and harassment of a minor." Granny's composure finally cracked. She needed to be stronger. I was helping her build character. "You tried to kill me," I sobbed. "You wanted me dead." "I wanted you gone," she corrected, like that was better. Dad's hands were shaking as he opened the cloud app on her phone. His face went white. "These photos, when were these taken?" I looked at the screen and felt my blood turn to ice. Images of me that I never posed for. They were pictures of me sleeping with my mouth open, drool on my pillow, taken from my doorway at weird angles. Dad's finger kept swiping and his face got paler with each photo. There were dozens of me changing in my room through the crack under my door, blurry shots of me in just underwear that made my skin crawl. The worst ones showed me in the bathroom, brushing my teeth in just a towel, stepping out of the shower behind the frosted glass. Dad dropped the phone and ran to the sink, dry heaving while Granny stood there with her arms crossed. I grabbed the phone and scrolled through more, finding pictures of me bent over picking up laundry, close-ups of my chest when I wore tank tops, even one of me crying in my sleep after Charles dumped me. The 911 operator was still on the line asking if we needed medical help, while Dad gripped the counter trying to breathe. He took the phone back with shaking hands and kept scrolling, finding folders organized by date going back 3 years. Some photos had captions like, "Fat cow eating again," under a picture of me having breakfast, or, "Look at those stretch marks," on a photo of me reaching for something on a high shelf. Dad showed the operator through the phone's camera what we were seeing, and she told us not to touch anything else. The detectives were on their way. Granny tried to grab the phone again, but Dad shoved her back hard enough that she stumbled into the wall. I couldn't stop looking at one photo where I was changing my pad in the bathroom, taken through a crack in the door I never knew existed. My whole body started shaking, and I ran to the bathroom, throwing up everything in my stomach while Dad yelled at Granny about hidden cameras. When I came back out, he was checking every corner of my room, running his hands along the walls looking for tiny holes or devices. 2 cops showed up faster than I expected, a young woman and an older man who took one look at the phone and called for backup. They made us all sit in different rooms while they documented everything, taking photos of Granny's phone screen with their own cameras. The female cop sat with me while I sobbed, explaining that these kinds of cases were more common than people think. Dad had to show them his phone too, proving he didn't have any of these images, while Granny sat in the kitchen insisting this was all being blown out of proportion. The older cop found more photos in her cloud storage, hundreds of them sorted into albums with cruel names like "Pig in Training" and "Future Failure." They called in a detective who specialized in cybercrimes and told us not to post anything online about this yet. Granny kept saying she had a right to take photos in her own home, that I walked around dressed inappropriately, that she was documenting my behavior for my own good. The detective arrived within an hour, introducing himself as Detective Murdoch, and immediately took possession of Granny's phone as evidence. He explained they'd need to do a full forensic analysis, and asked if we'd noticed any devices in the house that seemed out of place. Dad remembered Granny giving me a new alarm clock for my birthday, one with lots of features I never used, and the detective bagged it immediately. They found a tiny camera in it, positioned perfectly to see my bed and most of my room. Granny finally stopped talking when they told her she was detained for questioning, that taking voyeuristic photos of a minor was a serious crime. She demanded a lawyer and refused to leave, claiming this was her house too and we couldn't make her go. The cops explained she could leave voluntarily or in handcuffs, and she finally grabbed her purse, muttering about ungrateful family. They told her not to come back until the investigation was complete, that any attempt to contact us would violate the emergency protective order they were filing. After everyone left, Dad changed every lock in the house that night, even though it was past midnight. He went through every room with a flashlight, checking vents, smoke detectors, anywhere a camera could hide. I tried to sleep in his room but kept thinking about all those photos existing somewhere, wondering who else might have seen them. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw myself through her camera lens, vulnerable and exposed in my own home. The worst messages kept replaying in my head, mixing with the image of her watching me through cracks in doors. At 4 a.m, Dad was sitting on the floor next to the bed, crying harder than I'd ever seen him cry. He kept saying he should have known, should have protected me, should have seen the signs. Detective Murdoch called at 7 sharp, his voice professional but kind as he explained what would happen next. We needed to bring in all our devices, give him access to our cloud accounts, let them trace where the photos might have been shared. Dad immediately started calling the courthouse about a restraining order while I sat there feeling numb and empty. The clerk who helped him fast-tracked everything when she heard it involved cyberstalking of a minor. By noon, we had a temporary order that would keep Granny away for at least 2 weeks. Dad went straight to Home Depot and bought new locks for every door in the house. I watched him drill out the old ones, his jaw tight with focus as metal shavings fell onto the porch. He changed the garage code, the alarm system password, even the Wi-Fi network name and password. Then he started going through the house like a detective, pulling out old routers from the basement, USB drives from drawers, tablets we hadn't used in years. He piled everything in a box for Detective Murdoch, labeling each item with sticky notes about when we got them and who used them. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to write out a timeline of the bullying for the police. My hand cramped as I filled page after page, starting with the first message when I was 11 about my ugly braces. Each memory stung, but putting them in order, seeing the pattern of when they came, helped me feel less crazy. The messages always got worse after family dinners, or when Dad traveled for work. I highlighted the dates that matched Granny's visits, my stomach turning as the pattern became clear. The next morning, I met with Inez Foster at the school before first period. She had my file spread across her desk, years of notes calling me dramatic and attention-seeking. Her face got redder with each page she turned, crossing out old comments and writing corrections in the margins. She started drafting new letters for my permanent record, explaining the cyberstalking case and how it affected my behavior. She scheduled me for different class times to avoid the main hallways when gossip would be worst. Detective Murdoch came to our house that afternoon with evidence bags and forms. He explained how they'd trace IP addresses from each fake account, how the metadata on photos would show when and where they were taken. I handed over my phone, my hands shaking even though I knew it was necessary. He gave me a basic flip phone for emergencies, showing me how to use it like I was elderly. Dad spent the rest of the day on the phone with college admissions offices, his voice getting hoarse from explaining the same story over and over. Each school wanted different documentation, different forms, different proof that I hadn't actually withdrawn. I could hear him getting frustrated with the bureaucracy, having to spell Granny's name repeatedly, give the case number dozens of times. State University put him on hold for 40 minutes before transferring him to 3 different departments. That night, I barely slept, and at 3 a.m, I found myself standing in the bathroom with the shower running. The old urge to scrub my skin raw came flooding back, my brain telling me I smelled like fish just like Granny's messages said. But I remembered what Davina taught me in our emergency session, pressing my feet into the cold tile and naming 5 things I could see. The toilet, the sink, the towel, the soap, the mirror. 4 things I could touch. 3 things I could hear. 2 things I could smell. 1 thing I could taste. The urge passed and I turned off the water, counting it as a small win. 3 days later, Detective Murdoch called with his first update. The IP addresses from the fake accounts matched Granny's phone, her laptop, and the Wi-Fi at a coffee shop 2 blocks from her gym. He'd pulled security footage showing her there during the exact times the worst messages were sent. Having actual proof made me feel both validated and sick, like finally being believed, but also having to accept it really happened. Word had already spread at the school about the police cars at our house, and rumors flew about everything from drug raids to Dad being arrested. Kids stared at me in the hallways, whispering behind their hands. Someone posted on the school app that I'd finally snapped and attacked someone. Inez arranged for me to enter through the side door and attend classes during different periods, eating lunch in her office instead of the cafeteria. She walked me between classes the first day, glaring at anyone who tried to approach. During my next therapy session, Davina helped me understand what Granny had done using words I'd never heard before. She called it grooming, explaining how predators build trust while secretly harming their victims. She showed me how Granny positioned herself as my protector while being my attacker, making me doubt my own reality. The word abuse felt strange in my mouth when I said it out loud, but Davina kept reinforcing that's exactly what it was. For the first time, I felt angry instead of just sad and broken. Real, hot anger that made my fists clench. 2 weeks into the investigation, Dad was going through old phone bills when he found something. Granny had a second line on her account that we never knew about, active for the past 3 years. The number didn't match any phone we'd seen her use. He called Detective Murdoch immediately, reading off the number while pacing the kitchen. Within hours, Murdoch confirmed that number was linked to 2 of the anonymous accounts. They were building a case that felt airtight, each piece of evidence adding another wall around the truth of what she'd done to me. My phone buzzed 3 days later while I was eating cereal, and I almost ignored it, thinking it was another kid from the school asking for gossip. The name on the screen made me freeze with my spoon halfway to my mouth. It was from someone I hadn't talked to in over a year, a girl who used to sit with me at lunch before everything went bad. She'd sent me 17 screenshots from the anonymous school app, and my hands started shaking as I opened them one by one. Each message had timestamps showing exactly when they were posted, and I recognized the dates immediately. The first one was from my birthday dinner when Granny sat right next to me singing Happy Birthday. Another was from Christmas Eve when she helped me wrap presents for Dad. The worst one was from the night of the school play when she brought me flowers and told everyone how proud she was. I showed Dad the screenshots and watched his face turn gray as he connected the dots between each family moment and each cruel message. He printed them all out and added them to the growing pile of evidence we were collecting in a folder that kept getting thicker every day. 2 days later, we sat in a small office downtown, meeting with the assistant DA who looked tired but determined as she spread out all our evidence on her desk. She explained that they were looking at multiple charges including cyberstalking, harassment of a minor, and possibly even child endangerment given my suicide attempts. Her voice stayed professional as she warned us that these cases often take months to work through the system, and many end in plea deals rather than trials. She said Granny could face up to 5 years in prison, but realistically would probably get probation and mandatory counseling if she took a deal. The whole meeting lasted 2 hours, and I left feeling both hopeful and disappointed that justice might not look like what I imagined. That night, Dad couldn't sleep, and I found him sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. staring at old photo albums. He started talking about growing up with Beatrice as his mother, and how she'd always used money and guilt to control every decision he made. She paid for his college but reminded him daily that he owed her everything. She bought him his first car but took the keys whenever he disagreed with her. She helped with the down payment on our house but acted like she owned it. His voice broke when he told me how she'd threatened to take me away when I was a baby if he didn't let her move in after Mom died. Understanding that her manipulation started decades before I was born made me realize this was never really about me at all. Detective Murdoch called the next morning with news that made Dad pump his fist in the air. He'd found backup data for all 7 fake accounts stored in Granny's cloud storage, including drafts of messages she never sent that were even worse than what I'd received. He was getting warrants to search her apartment and her car for any other devices or evidence that might help the case. The detective said he'd seen a lot of cases, but this level of documentation and planning was unusual, and would help prove premeditation. Meanwhile at the school, Inez had been working on fixing years of damage to my records. She drafted official letters for my permanent file explaining the circumstances, and correcting all the notes that labeled me as manipulative, attention-seeking, and dramatic. Each letter had to be approved by the principal and the school board, but Inez pushed it through in record time. She showed me the updated file with the corrected information, and I actually cried seeing my dignity restored on paper, even if it felt like a small victory compared to everything I'd lost. A week later, I got an email from State University that made my stomach flip. They'd received our appeal about my scholarship and would review it but couldn't guarantee anything. The email was formal and cold, explaining that withdrawn applications were rarely reconsidered, and scholarship funds had already been reallocated. They needed extensive documentation, including police reports, school statements, and proof that the withdrawal was fraudulent. Dad spent the entire weekend gathering everything they asked for, while I tried not to get my hopes up. The police served search warrants at Granny's apartment on a Tuesday morning while she was at her yoga class. They seized her laptop, 2 tablets, an old phone from her nightstand drawer, and a box they found in her closet that made the detective call Dad immediately. The box had hundreds of printed photos of me, including ones from my social media that she'd edited with cruel comments, and some that looked like they'd been taken without my knowledge. There were also printouts of fake social media profiles she'd created using my photos to message boys at the school pretending to be me. During my next therapy session, Davina taught me how to set boundaries without falling into my old pattern of obsessively checking for new messages. We practiced blocking numbers and accounts without reading them first, something that felt impossible but necessary. She had me write down what I would do instead of checking my phone when I felt the urge, and we role-played different scenarios where someone might try to contact me. The breathing exercises felt stupid at first, but they actually helped when my phone buzzed and I didn't recognize the number. Detective Murdoch met with us again to explain how he thought Granny had taken all those photos of me. She'd accessed my phone while I napped on the couch during movie nights, left doors cracked when I was changing, and synced our devices through the family cloud account Dad had set up years ago. She'd taken screenshots of my private messages, saved my photos, and even accessed my location data to know where I was at all times. Understanding the mechanics of how she invaded my privacy helped me feel less crazy and paranoid, even though it still made my skin crawl. Dad found a victim advocacy group that specifically worked with cybercrime victims and arranged for someone to accompany me to any court proceedings. The advocate, a woman who introduced herself over the phone with a calm and steady voice, explained that her job was to make sure I understood everything that was happening and to be my support person in the courtroom. Knowing I wouldn't have to face Granny alone in court made the knot in my chest loosen just a little bit. That same afternoon, I sat at Dad's laptop and typed out an email to Juliet's mom with shaking fingers. I attached the police case number and explained how the drug rumors came from fake accounts that Granny controlled. My finger hovered over the send button for 5 whole minutes before I finally clicked it. The whoosh sound made my stomach drop, but I knew I had to try to fix what Granny broke. Dad rubbed my shoulder and said we'd done everything we could for now. 2 days passed without any response, and I tried not to check my phone every 5 seconds. Then while I was eating cereal on Thursday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Juliet. She'd written just 4 words that made me cry into my Lucky Charms. The text said she didn't know, and she was sorry. She didn't promise we'd hang out again, or that things would go back to normal, but just having her believe me felt huge. I screenshot the message and sent it to Davina, who reminded me that small steps still counted as progress. Detective Murdoch called that afternoon while Dad was making dinner. He confirmed that most of the photos Granny took only went to her own fake accounts and hadn't been spread around the internet like I'd been scared of. The takedown notices were working, and the sites were removing everything connected to those accounts. My whole body felt lighter, even though I still felt gross, knowing she'd watched me through cracked doors and taken pictures. He also mentioned finding more evidence on her devices that would help the case, but said he'd explain more when we met in person. The next morning, Dad and I drove to the school for a meeting with the principal and 2 assistant principals. Inez was already there with a thick folder of documentation and a determined look on her face. The administrators listened while Dad explained everything that had happened and showed them the police reports. They kept exchanging worried looks, and I could tell they were thinking about lawsuits. The principal cleared his throat and said they'd update my records immediately to reflect the truth about the bullying. They approved a reduced schedule for the rest of the semester so I could focus on therapy and healing without falling behind. One assistant principal kept apologizing and saying they should have investigated more when I first reported problems. I wanted to scream at them but just nodded and let Dad handle the talking. 3 weeks later, we got notice that Granny's arraignment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The victim advocate called to prepare me for what would happen, and reminded me I didn't have to say anything at this hearing. Tuesday morning came too fast, and my hands were sweating as we walked into the courthouse. Granny sat at the defendant's table looking completely calm in a gray suit like this was just another business meeting. Her lawyer stood up and started talking about mental health concerns and family misunderstandings. My face got hot and I could feel my anger building, but the advocate put her hand on my arm to steady me. The judge read the charges and Granny pleaded not guilty, which made Dad grip the bench so hard his knuckles turned white. After the hearing, Davina helped me start writing my victim impact statement for the eventual trial. We sat in her office for 3 hours while I tried to put 8 years of pain into words that a judge would understand. Every sentence felt impossible, but having control over telling my story helped me feel less helpless. I wrote about the weight loss and the suicide attempts, and how she held me while I cried about the same messages she'd sent. Davina helped me organize it so it made sense instead of just being a mess of hurt feelings. A week later, Dad got calls from 2 smaller colleges saying they'd reviewed our appeal about the fraudulent withdrawals. They couldn't offer the same scholarships, but they were willing to reinstate my admission for the fall semester. It wasn't State University with the full ride, but at least I had options again. Dad started researching their programs and printing out information about dorms and meal plans. He was trying so hard to give me something to look forward to instead of just focusing on the legal stuff. One evening, Dad showed me an appointment card for his own therapist and explained he'd started going twice a week. He said talking to someone was helping him understand why he never saw the signs and how Granny had manipulated him since he was little. Watching him work on his own stuff made me trust that we were both serious about getting better together. He even bought us both journals to write in when the feelings got too big. Detective Murdoch called with news that made me sit down hard on the kitchen floor. He'd found emails Granny sent to Charles's mother full of lies about me being unstable and dangerous. The emails claimed I was obsessed with Charles and might hurt myself if he broke up with me. There were even fake screenshots she'd created to make it look like I was threatening him. Charles's mom had believed every word and told him he had to end things immediately for his safety. Having proof that Granny destroyed my first real relationship made me sob with relief and rage at the same time. The assistant principal called Dad the next week to schedule another meeting about updating my disciplinary record. She formally apologized for how the school handled everything and showed us the new notes they'd added to my file. The words, "victim of sustained harassment," replaced all the old stuff about me being dramatic and seeking attention. It helped, even though I was still mad it took police involvement for them to believe me. Davina gave me a flyer for a support group that met every Tuesday at the community center downtown. I walked into that first meeting feeling like I didn't belong there because everyone else probably had real problems. The room had 12 chairs in a circle and 7 people already sitting when I arrived. A woman with gray hair started talking about her brother who stole her identity and ruined her credit. Another person shared about their mom who posted fake revenge porn of them online. Hearing their stories made my chest feel less tight, because I wasn't the only one whose family member tried to destroy them. The next morning, we had to go to court for the restraining order hearing. The judge spent 45 minutes reading through all the IP address evidence that Detective Murdoch had collected. She asked me a few questions about how long the harassment had been happening. Dad showed her screenshots of the worst messages on his phone. The judge granted a 3-year no-contact order that included digital contact and third-party contact. Walking out of the courthouse with that paper felt like putting on armor I desperately needed. 2 days later, Dad got a call from a lawyer representing Granny who wanted to meet about a possible plea deal. We sat in a conference room while the lawyer explained that Granny would plead guilty to digital harassment if we agreed to no jail time. Dad told him we'd think about it, but we both knew avoiding a trial might be better for my mental health. That same week, Dad was going through old paperwork in the basement when he found documents about a trust fund. Granny's father had set it up for my education before he died, but she never told us it existed. The account had $30,000 in it with Granny listed as the trustee. Dad immediately called our lawyer to figure out how to protect that money before she could drain it. We also met with a civil attorney to ask about suing for my lost scholarships and the damage to my reputation. She looked through all our documentation and said we might have a case, but it would cost at least $20,000 in legal fees. The chances of winning weren't great since proving monetary damages from cyberbullying is really hard. Dad and I decided the criminal case was enough, and we didn't need to spend money we didn't have on a lawsuit. A week later, I got an email from State University asking for official police documentation for my scholarship appeal. They also wanted a letter from Inez supporting my application. I forwarded everything to Inez, who wrote a 3-page letter about how the harassment affected my academic performance. Having official people backing me up gave me hope that maybe I could still go to my dream school. Davina helped me practice reading my victim impact statement for court. The first time I tried, I only got through 2 sentences before I started crying too hard to continue. She taught me breathing techniques to use when I felt overwhelmed. We practiced 3 times a week in her office until I could read the whole thing without my voice shaking too much. By the 5th time, I made it all the way through without stopping. Detective Murdoch called with good news about the photos Granny had taken of me. His tech team had gotten them removed from every site she'd uploaded them to. They used something called a DMCA takedown notice that forced the sites to delete everything. Knowing those pictures weren't floating around the internet anymore helped me sleep better at night. Juliet texted me asking if we could meet for coffee to talk. I picked a Starbucks near the mall where we used to hang out before everything fell apart. She showed up 10 minutes late and we sat across from each other not really knowing what to say. She told me her mom finally read the police report and felt terrible about believing the lies. I said I understood why she had to protect herself even though it hurt me. We both knew we couldn't go back to being best friends, but at least we could end things without hate between us. She hugged me before she left, and we both knew it was goodbye. Dad spent the next weekend at Granny's storage unit with a moving truck. He took everything valuable, including some antique furniture that belonged to his dad. He also went to the bank and removed her as beneficiary on all his accounts. The bank manager helped him file paperwork to close her access to the education trust fund. Dad said he felt guilty for a minute but then remembered what she did to me, and the guilt went away. Every step we took to cut her out of our lives made me feel safer and more in control of my own future. 2 weeks later, I got an email from State University with a hearing date for my scholarship appeal, and my hands shook as I read it 3 times to make sure it was real. I forwarded it to Inez right away, and she called me during her lunch break to say she'd already started writing her support letter. She spent an hour asking me questions about how the harassment affected my grades and attendance so she could include specific examples in her letter. The next morning, she emailed me a copy of what she'd written, and it was 3 pages long with dates and details about every time I'd broken down at the school. Reading someone else describe what happened to me made it feel more real and less like something I'd imagined. I printed out 5 copies of everything for the hearing and organized them in a binder with tabs for each section. Dad helped me practice answering questions the panel might ask, and we went through it until I could explain everything without crying. The plea hearing for Beatrice was scheduled for the same week as my scholarship appeal, and the timing made me more nervous. I spent hours working with Davina on breathing exercises to use if I started panicking during either hearing. She had me write down 3 things I wanted to say at the plea hearing in case I froze up when it was time to speak. The prosecutor called to explain that Beatrice's lawyer had agreed to a plea deal where she'd plead guilty to cyberstalking and harassment of a minor. She'd get 2 years probation and mandatory therapy, but no jail time unless she violated the terms. Part of me wanted her in jail, but the prosecutor said this was actually a good outcome since these cases are hard to prove. At least there would be a guilty plea on record, and she'd have to admit what she did in court. The morning of the plea hearing, I threw up twice before Dad drove us to the courthouse. My victim advocate met us outside and walked us through security and to the right courtroom. Beatrice was already there with her lawyer, and she looked smaller than I remembered. When the judge asked her how she pleaded, she said guilty in a voice. So quiet, the judge made her repeat it. Then it was my turn to read my victim impact statement, and my legs felt weak as I walked to the podium. My voice shook on the first sentence, but I kept going, and by the second paragraph, it got stronger. I told the court about the 3 times I tried to end my life, and how she held me afterward pretending to care. I described losing 38 pounds because she convinced me I was disgusting while making me special meals. I explained how she destroyed my relationship with Charles, and turned my friends against me with lies. When I got to the part about the photos she took of me without my knowledge, my voice cracked, but I didn't stop. I looked right at her when I said she stole 8 years of my childhood and tried to destroy my future. She stared at the table the whole time and never looked up once. The judge thanked me for my statement and said he'd reviewed all the evidence, including the IP addresses and timestamps. He ordered Beatrice to pay $15,000 in restitution for my therapy costs over the next 2 years. She also had to stay away from me and Dad with no contact, direct or indirect, including through third parties. He scheduled a review hearing in 6 months to check her compliance with therapy and probation requirements. When he said the court recognized the severe harm she'd caused me, I started crying because finally someone with authority was saying it wasn't my fault. After court, Dad and I met with the civil attorney we'd consulted about suing Beatrice for damages. She looked through all our documentation and said we had a case, but it would cost at least $20,000 in legal fees with no guarantee of winning. Even if we won, Beatrice might not have money to pay since she'd already been ordered to pay restitution. The attorney said the criminal conviction and restitution order were actually good outcomes, and a civil suit would just drag everything out for years. Dad and I talked about it in the parking lot and decided we didn't want to spend money we didn't have on a lawsuit. Having her criminal conviction on record was enough, and we needed to focus on moving forward instead of staying stuck in legal battles. That night, I went through my phone and deleted every anonymous app I'd been checking obsessively for new messages. The Yik Yak, Whisper, After School, Lipsy, and 3 others I'd installed to monitor what people were saying about me. Each time I hit delete, it felt like dropping a heavy backpack I'd been carrying for years. I realized I'd been spending hours every day searching for mean messages and preparing myself for the next attack. Without those apps, I had so much extra time and mental space that I didn't know what to do with myself at first. 3 days later was my scholarship appeal hearing at State University, and Dad took the day off work to drive me there. The panel had 5 people, including the financial aid director and the dean of admissions. They'd already reviewed all the documentation, including the police reports and Inez's letter. They asked me about my grades dropping junior year, and I explained how the messages got worse when I started dating Charles. They wanted to know my plan for handling stress in college, and I told them about my therapy and the coping strategies I'd learned. One woman asked what I'd do if I encountered online harassment again, and I said I'd report it immediately instead of hiding it. After 40 minutes, they said they'd make a decision within a week and email me the results. The waiting was torture, and I checked my email every 10 minutes, even though I knew that wouldn't make the decision come faster. 5 days later, the email finally came, and State University reinstated my admission with a partial scholarship covering half tuition. I'd have to maintain a 3.0 GPA and follow a wellness plan that included regular counseling check-ins. It wasn't the full scholarship I'd originally been offered, but it was enough to make college possible with loans and Dad's help. I called Inez immediately, and she said she was proud of me for fighting to get my future back. Dad and I drove to State University that weekend to look at dorm options and pay the housing deposit. We picked a dorm on the opposite side of campus from where Beatrice lived, 15 miles away in a different town. The distance made me feel safer, even though the no-contact order should protect me. We paid the deposit right there so I'd have a guaranteed spot for fall semester. On the drive home, Dad said we'd figure out the money and make it work no matter what. The next week, Inez called to say the school was updating my transcript with an official note about extenuating circumstances. It would explain that external factors beyond my control had affected my academic performance junior year. Having that on my permanent record meant other colleges and future employers would understand the grade drop wasn't because I was lazy or didn't care. It felt like getting a piece of my reputation back after Beatrice had tried so hard to destroy it. 2 weeks later, my phone buzzed with a text from Juliet while I was packing boxes for college. She wrote that she was happy I got into State and hoped college would give me the fresh start I deserved. I typed back a simple thank you and wished her luck at her own school. We both knew this was goodbye, but it felt peaceful instead of painful. That same afternoon, Davina and I sat in her office with a calendar spread across her desk, marking all the dates that might trigger me. She circled the anniversary of when the messages started, and the dates of my 3 attempts. We wrote down specific actions I'd take on those days, like calling Dad or going for a run or watching comedy shows. She gave me a list of warning signs to watch for, like skipping meals or staying up all night checking my phone. We practiced what I'd do if someone tried to contact me anonymously again, and I repeated the steps until they became automatic. 3 days later, Dad came home from his first support group meeting with red eyes, but a lighter expression on his face. He told me there were 12 other people there whose parents had hurt them in different ways. He said hearing their stories helped him understand that the guilt he felt wasn't his fault, and that Beatrice had trained him since childhood to doubt himself. The group leader gave him homework to write down all the times his mother had made him feel crazy for questioning her. Detective Murdoch called the next morning to confirm everything was officially closed with Beatrice's guilty plea recorded in the system. He emailed me a copy of the case closure report for my scholarship file and said he was glad I'd come forward. His voice was warm when he thanked me for being brave enough to report it. That weekend, I went through my entire room with 3 boxes labeled donate, trash, and maybe. The necklace Beatrice gave me for my 16th birthday went in the donate box along with the sweater she knitted last Christmas. I threw away the birthday cards where she'd written about loving me while secretly sending those horrible messages. The photo of us at the beach when I was 10 went in the maybe box because that was before the bullying started. Dad helped me carry everything to the car, and we dropped the donations at Goodwill without talking about what was in the bags. My bedroom felt bigger with all her gifts gone, and I could breathe easier without those reminders staring at me. The morning of my last therapy session before college, Davina had me write down realistic goals on index cards. We kept them simple, like attending all my classes the first week and eating 3 meals a day. She helped me pick one campus club to try to. We looked up their meeting schedule together. We agreed I'd delete all anonymous apps and avoid any platforms where people could contact me without using real names. She taught me how to recognize when I was spiraling and gave me a worksheet to fill out when anxiety hit. We practiced saying no to things that felt unsafe, and she reminded me that protecting myself wasn't being weak. 2 months later on move-in day, Dad carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs to my dorm room while I arranged my desk supplies. We hung string lights around the window and set up my laptop on the desk facing away from the door so no one could look over my shoulder. He helped me test all the locks and showed me how to use the pepper spray he'd bought. We found the campus counseling center together, and I made an appointment for the following week. When everything was unpacked, we sat on my narrow dorm bed and agreed to video calls every Sunday at 4. He promised not to ask too many questions if I promised to tell him when things got hard. We hugged for a long time before he left, and I watched from my window as he walked back to his car. 20 minutes later, I was heading to freshman orientation when my phone buzzed with a notification from an anonymous messaging app I'd forgotten to delete. My finger hovered over it for half a second, before I held down the icon and deleted the entire app without reading the message. The girl walking next to me asked if I was coming to the icebreaker games, and I said yes, sliding my phone into my pocket. We walked into the student center together where hundreds of freshmen were getting name tags and free t-shirts. I grabbed a slice of pizza and sat at a table with 5 other kids from my floor. Nobody there knew anything about Beatrice or the messages or the court case. They just saw another nervous freshman trying to figure out college. When someone asked where I was from, I gave a normal answer without mentioning anything that had happened. The orientation leader started explaining the campus bus system, and I pulled out my notebook to write down the routes. My phone stayed silent in my pocket, and I didn't check it once during the entire 3-hour program. Well, folks, that's been quite a ride. Really appreciate you hanging out with me and letting me ramble through all these thoughts today. It's been fun wondering about it all together. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.
When did one of the boys get sent to prison? Lamont had the biggest crush on this quiet girl named Sherry, who always sat in the back of our psych class. Lamont wasn't just nice to Sherry, though, because he was that genuinely sweet guy who helped everyone with homework and remembered people's birthdays. Sherry was the type of girl who wore oversized hoodies and kept her earbuds in between classes. She'd sketch in her notebooks during lunch instead of sitting with other people. She wasn't unfriendly or anything, just really kept to herself. Lamont noticed her the first week of junior year, and from that point on, he was completely hooked. Lamont started doing these romantic gestures that everyone thought were adorable. He figured out which locker was hers and started leaving single flowers in the vents every Monday morning. Not roses or anything expensive, just pretty wildflowers he'd pick on his way to school. Sherry would find them and tuck them into her backpack without saying anything, but you could sometimes see her smell them when she thought nobody was looking. Then Lamont stepped up his game and started writing her poems. He'd fold them into tiny origami shapes and slip them through her locker vents too. The poems weren't cheesy or weird, just sweet little observations about her drawings or how she always wore mismatched socks. Other girls in our grade were jealous, saying they wished someone would notice little details about them like that. Everyone was rooting for Lamont to finally ask Sherry out. He'd been doing the flower and poem thing for 3 months, and we all figured Sherry must have known who they were from. Lamont wasn't exactly subtle about his crush, since he'd stare at her during class and always tried to be her lab partner. Even the teachers seemed to notice and would pair them together for projects. Things escalated when Lamont started leaving more elaborate gifts. He found out Sherry loved this specific Japanese candy and ordered a bunch online to leave in her locker. He made her a playlist on Spotify and wrote the link on decorative paper. One time, he even left a small succulent plant with a note saying it reminded him of her because it was beautiful and didn't need much attention to thrive. The whole school was invested in their story by this point. People would whisper about whether Sherry would ever acknowledge Lamont's efforts or if she even knew who was leaving the gifts. Some kids thought she was playing hard to get, while others said she was just too shy to respond. Lamont's friends kept encouraging him to just talk to her directly, but he said he wanted to be patient. Then, on a regular Thursday morning, everything went insane. We were in second period when we heard shouting in the hallway, and everyone rushed to the classroom doors to see what was happening. 2 police officers were walking Lamont out of the building in actual handcuffs. His face was bright red, and he kept his head down while teachers tried to move students back to their classrooms. Nobody could concentrate for the rest of the day. Rumors flew around about what Lamont could have possibly done. Some people thought maybe he'd been caught with drugs, but that didn't make sense because Lamont was straight edge. Others wondered if he'd gotten in a fight, but Lamont had never even raised his voice at anyone. The principal made an announcement saying they couldn't discuss the situation. Lamont's social media went completely dark that day. Usually he posted motivational quotes and pictures from school events, but everything stopped. His best friend wouldn't tell anyone what happened, and Sherry was notably absent from chemistry class. Teachers kept shutting down any conversation about the arrest and threatened detention for anyone spreading rumors. A whole week passed with no word from Lamont. His Instagram stayed quiet, and he didn't respond to any messages. Sherry came back to school, but looked even more closed off than usual. She wore her hood up constantly and switched seats to the very back corner of every classroom. People tried to ask her about Lamont, but she'd just put her earbuds in and ignore them. Finally, on Sunday night, Lamont broke his silence with an Instagram post that made everyone's jaw drop. He posted a long rant about how Sherry had ruined his life and destroyed his future. He said she was ungrateful for everything he'd done for her, and that she'd twisted something beautiful into something criminal. The worst part was the last line where he wrote that Sherry now had no choice but to marry him because of what she'd done. The comments exploded immediately with people asking what he meant. Lamont wouldn't respond to anyone and disabled comments within an hour. Screenshots of the post spread through group chats like wildfire. Everyone was trying to piece together what could have happened between the arrest and this bizarre post about marriage. Monday morning, Sherry wasn't at school. Her absence felt heavy, especially after Lamont's cryptic post the night before. People kept checking her social media throughout the day, hoping for some explanation. Then around dinner time, a notification popped up that changed everything. Sherry had posted for the first time ever on her usually empty Instagram. The caption simply read, "It's time I break my silence about Lamont Cooper." My phone screen lit up with the notification, and I clicked on it immediately, my hands actually shaking a little as Sherry's post started loading on my screen. The post was crazy long, way longer than anything I'd ever seen on Instagram, and right away I could see it was packed with screenshots and timestamps and photos of documents. Her first words made my stomach feel weird, because she wrote that she never wanted to be the center of attention, which is why she stayed quiet for so long. But now she had to speak up. She explained that what everyone at the school thought looked like romance from the outside actually felt like being hunted from the inside, and those words made me sit up straighter on my bed. The first screenshot she posted was an email she'd sent to Jane Winters way back in September, asking for help, because Lamont's constant staring in class made her really uncomfortable and scared. Jane's response underneath made me feel sick, because she'd written back that Lamont seemed like such a nice boy, and maybe Sherry was just misinterpreting his friendliness as something else. I kept scrolling, and Sherry described finding that first flower in her locker, and how conflicted she felt about it, because yeah, it was pretty, but her locker was supposed to be her private space where she kept her stuff. She explained that she kept the flowers because throwing them away in front of everyone would have caused drama, and people would have called her mean or ungrateful. Then she posted photos of some of the poems Lamont had left, and I could see where she'd highlighted certain lines with yellow marker on her phone. The poems had started out sweet talking about her art, but then they got creepy fast with stuff about her mismatched socks, and which exact table she sat at during lunch, and how she chewed her pencil when she was thinking. One poem even mentioned the specific brand of gum she kept in her backpack, which made my skin feel cold, because how would he even know that? Sherry wrote about how teachers kept pairing them together for projects, even though she'd quietly asked multiple times to work alone or with someone else. She posted screenshots of 3 different emails where she specifically asked not to be partnered with Lamont, but every single teacher was ignored her requests and kept putting them together anyway. The next part made me actually gasp out loud because she posted a photo that showed the bottom of that succulent plant Lamont had given her, and there was an air tag covered in potting soil stuck to the bottom of the pot. She included screenshots from the Find My app on her phone showing her exact bus route to and from the school, her home address marked with a pin, and the art store she went to on weekends that she'd never told anyone about. My hands were sweating now as I kept reading, and she documented how she'd tried taking different routes home from the school to avoid him, but she'd still spot Lamont's blue Honda near places she'd never mentioned to anyone at the school. She had photos she'd taken through store windows, showing his car parked outside the coffee shop where she studied, and the bookstore where she bought her art supplies, and even outside her cousin's house across town. The fear in her words wasn't paranoia at all, because she was literally being tracked and followed everywhere she went for months. She posted a screenshot showing that exactly 1 week before Lamont got arrested, she'd filed a formal report with the school resource officer and included all her evidence about the stalking. The case number was partially visible in the corner of the document, and seeing that official paperwork made everything feel way more real than any of the rumors we'd been spreading. 3 days before the arrest happened, the school had actually issued Lamont an official no-contact order, which meant he wasn't allowed to come near her, or talk to her, or leave anything in her locker anymore. But then she posted screenshots of messages she'd been getting from anonymous Instagram accounts, with weird names like LS_Destiny 2024 and Sherry Lamont Forever, sending her messages about Destiny and how she'd understand their connection soon. The account names all had variations of their initials put together, and the messages got progressively weirder, talking about soulmates and eternal bonds, and how some people were meant to be together no matter what. I scrolled through screenshot after screenshot of these messages, and they all had the same writing style as Lamont's regular posts, with the same weird punctuation habits and favorite phrases he always used. My group chat was blowing up with notifications as everyone else read Sherry's post at the same time, but I couldn't look away from her story to check what people were saying. She'd posted timestamps showing the anonymous messages came in clusters right after school hours and late at night, and always from different accounts that would get deleted after sending just a few messages. The whole thing painted a picture of someone who wouldn't take no for an answer and kept finding ways around every boundary she tried to set up. She wrote that the morning of the arrest, she'd found more of that Japanese candy in her locker, even though the no-contact order specifically said Lamont couldn't leave her any more gifts. She'd gone straight to the resource officer with the candy still in the wrapper as evidence, and within an hour the police were walking Lamont out of the building while she hid in Jane Winters' office crying. The last part of her post addressed Lamont's crazy marriage comment directly, and what she revealed made everyone reading completely lose it. She explained that a friend of hers who was really good with computers had helped her look through some stuff after Lamont's weird post about marriage. They found his search history from the school library computers where he'd been looking up all this legal stuff about something called spousal privilege. The screenshots she posted showed searches like, "Can wife testify against husband?" and "Marriage prevents testimony criminal case," and "How to marry someone quickly without consent." My stomach turned reading those search terms because they painted such a creepy picture of what Lamont was thinking. Sherry wrote that Lamont had watched some crime show where a character couldn't testify against their spouse, and he'd taken that as actual legal advice. He genuinely thought that if he could somehow force her to marry him, then she wouldn't be able to testify about the stalking and tracking. The friend had also found posts Lamont made on legal advice forums, asking if marriage would protect him from prosecution if his wife was the only witness. People in the comments had told him that's not how spousal privilege works, and that forced marriage isn't even legal. But Lamont kept arguing with them, saying they didn't understand his situation. Sherry's post went on to explain that the morning he got arrested, she'd found more of that Japanese candy stuffed in her locker, even though the no-contact order specifically said he couldn't come near her or leave her anything. She'd taken the candy straight to the resource officer with the wrapper still sealed as proof. The officer called the real police right away, and they pulled the security footage showing Lamont at her locker at 6:30 that morning, before anyone else was at the school. Within an hour, they had him in handcuffs, walking him out, while she sat in Jane Winter's office shaking and crying. She wrote that she could hear him yelling in the hallway about how this was all a misunderstanding and how Sherry was overreacting to a simple gift. The last part of her post wasn't angry or vengeful, but just tired-sounding. She wrote that she was exhausted from being treated like entertainment for everyone at the school. People kept asking her for details like her trauma was some kind of reality show they could gossip about. She said she never asked to be the girl from the stalking case, and she just wanted to get through junior year without being defined by what Lamont did to her. Her final words were asking everyone to please stop sharing screenshots of Lamont's posts and making memes about the situation, because every time she saw them, it brought everything back. I sat there in my room after reading her whole post and felt physically sick to my stomach. Just a few months ago, I'd been one of the people calling Lamont's flower thing adorable and saying I wished someone would notice me like that. I'd literally told my friends that Sherry was lucky to have someone care about her so much. Now reading about the tracking device and the search history and everything else, I realized how badly I'd misread the whole situation. My phone kept buzzing with notifications from our group chat, where everyone was losing their minds over Sherry's revelations. People were sending paragraph after paragraph, analyzing every detail, and speculating about what would happen next. Some were defending themselves, saying they couldn't have known, while others were attacking Lamont with really harsh language. I couldn't bring myself to type anything in the group chat, because what was there to say that wouldn't sound hollow or self-serving? Instead, I opened Instagram and went to Sherry's profile, where her post already had hundreds of comments. I typed out a simple direct message that just said I was sorry I didn't see what was really happening and that she didn't need to respond. I deleted it and rewrote it 3 times, trying to make it sound less like I was asking for forgiveness and more like I just wanted her to know someone recognized their mistakes. Finally, I just sent, "I'm sorry I didn't see it. No response needed," and put my phone down. The next morning at the school felt completely different from any other day. The hallways were buzzing with conversations, but they were all whispered and tense instead of the usual loud chatter. Everyone had their phones out showing each other Sherry's post or screenshots of Lamont's creepy search history. Teachers looked uncomfortable and kept trying to get students to put their phones away, but even they seemed distracted. I saw Jane Winters walking through the main hallway with her head down, not making eye contact with anyone. A couple of students tried to approach her, but she just kept walking faster toward her office. During lunch, I decided to find Jane and ask her about those emails Sherry had posted, showing she'd asked for help months ago. I knocked on her office door, and she let me in looking tired and defensive already. I asked her why she hadn't taken Sherry's concerns seriously when she'd specifically said Lamont made her uncomfortable. Jane immediately shifted into this formal mode, talking about liability and following proper protocol and how she couldn't discuss individual student cases. She kept using phrases like appropriate channels and documented procedures, but wouldn't actually address why she'd dismissed Sherry's fears as misunderstanding friendliness. I pressed her about the email where she'd called Lamont such a nice boy, and she said that was taken out of context. She started talking about how she has to balance hundreds of student concerns and how hindsight is 20/20, but I could tell she was just covering herself. I left her office feeling frustrated because she clearly wasn't going to admit she'd failed Sherry. Later that afternoon, Ruby Hogan published this really well-researched article on the school news website. She'd created a whole timeline of events, starting from when Lamont first started leaving flowers, all the way through his arrest. She included links to the school's actual policies about harassment and stalking, showing how multiple procedures weren't followed. Ruby managed to write it without sensationalizing anything, but the facts alone made it impossible to ignore how badly the administration had messed up. She'd even gotten quotes from other students who'd witnessed concerning behavior that teachers had ignored. The article went viral within hours, with parents sharing it on Facebook and calling for accountability. That evening, I was doing homework when my phone buzzed with a text from Ron Gould. His message said he really needed to talk to someone about Lamont and asked if we could meet after school tomorrow. The way he wrote it sounded lost and confused, like he couldn't process what was happening. I agreed to meet him because Ron had been Lamont's best friend since middle school, and I figured he was struggling to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the person in Sherry's post. The next day after last period, Ron met me by the gym, looking exhausted. He pulled out his phone and showed me screenshots he'd been collecting from relationship advice forums and Reddit. Lamont had been posting for months under throwaway accounts asking for advice about Sherry. The posts started out seeming normal enough, asking how to get a shy girl to notice him, but the responses he got were all about how persistence pays off, and grand gestures win hearts. And, if she's not saying no, she's interested. People kept telling him that girls play hard to get, and that he needed to show his dedication through consistent romantic actions. Ron scrolled through post after post, where strangers on the internet encouraged Lamont to keep pushing, despite what they called token resistance. Some comments even said that leaving gifts was better than talking, because it showed effort without pressure. The worst part was seeing how these toxic responses shaped Lamont's behavior over time. His posts got more intense, and the advice got worse, with people telling him that true love requires sacrifice, and that someday Sherry would realize what she'd been missing. Ron said Lamont would read these responses out loud sometimes, and talk about how the internet understood his situation better than people at the school. None of it excused what Lamont did, but seeing how he'd been encouraged by strangers who treated stalking like romance made the whole thing even more messed up. Ron put his phone away and stared at the ground for a long moment before telling me something that made my blood run cold. He said about 3 weeks ago, Lamont had mentioned this weird thing about how married people couldn't testify against each other in court. Ron thought it was just one of those random facts Lamont liked to share since he watched a lot of crime shows, but Lamont kept bringing it up in strange contexts, like when they were talking about college applications or summer plans. Now that creepy Instagram post about Sherry having to marry him suddenly made sick sense. It was never about love or romance or any of that. Lamont actually believed that if he could somehow get Sherry to marry him, she wouldn't be able to testify about whatever he'd done. Ron looked physically ill as he explained how Lamont had even looked up marriage laws in our state and found out that 16-year-olds could get married with parental consent. The whole thing was so calculated and twisted that Ron said he couldn't even recognize his best friend anymore. The next morning during homeroom, the principal's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that made everyone groan and roll their eyes. Starting next week, all students would have to attend mandatory workshops about consent and healthy relationships during advisory periods. Teachers would also be going through additional training on recognizing concerning behaviors and proper reporting procedures. The announcement felt like closing the barn door after the horse already escaped, but I guess it was better than nothing. Some kids complained about losing free periods, while others whispered that this was all because of the Lamont situation. Teachers looked uncomfortable when students asked questions and just kept repeating that this was standard procedure. That weekend, I was scrolling through Instagram when I saw a post from one of Sherry's few friends that made my stomach drop. Someone had left a threatening note under Sherry's windshield while her car was parked at the grocery store, calling her horrible names and saying she ruined an innocent guy's life. The friend posted security footage from the store that showed a figure in a dark hoodie approaching the car, but the image was too blurry to identify who it was. People in the comments were split between outrage and speculation about whether it was one of Lamont's friends or just some random person who believed his side of things. The store manager had already given the footage to police, but without a clear face, there wasn't much they could do. Ruby posted on the school news site Monday with another bombshell article that had everyone talking. Through a public records request, she'd gotten copies of emails between teachers from earlier in the year. One email chain showed a chemistry teacher explicitly putting Sherry and Lamont together as lab partners, even after Sherry had submitted a written request to work alone or with someone else. The teacher had actually written that pairing them would be good for Sherry because it would help her come out of her shell and make friends. Another email showed the same teacher telling other staff that Lamont was such a sweet boy for trying to befriend the quiet girl. Ruby's article pointed out how these decisions completely were ignored, Sherry's stated preferences, and created situations where she was forced to interact with someone who made her uncomfortable. Parents started sharing the article on Facebook, demanding to know why student requests were being ignored. Later that week, I heard from a friend who worked in the main office that Jane had a private meeting with Sherry and her parents. Apparently, Jane apologized for not taking Sherry's concerns seriously and worked out a whole plan for academic accommodations. Sherry would get extended deadlines on assignments she missed, could take tests in a separate quiet room, and wouldn't be penalized for any absences related to the legal proceedings. My friend said Sherry looked exhausted during the meeting and her mom had to do most of the talking. The accommodations were good, but everyone knew they couldn't undo months of Jane dismissing Sherry's complaints and telling her to give Lamont a chance. The juvenile court scheduled Lamont's arraignment for the following Tuesday, and word spread quickly through school. A victim services coordinator had met with Sherry to explain her rights in the legal process and what to expect during the proceedings. She wouldn't have to be in the same room as Lamont and could provide her statement through video or written form if she wanted. The coordinator also helped set up counseling services and made sure Sherry knew about the protective order that was already in place. Everything moved slowly through the system, but at least things were actually happening now. Wednesday evening, I decided to attend the school board meeting after my mom said parents were planning to speak about the situation. The auditorium was packed with angry parents and concerned community members. Some parents stood up to defend Lamont, saying he was just a confused kid who didn't understand boundaries and deserved a second chance. Others demanded real accountability and wanted to know how the school had failed so badly at protecting a student who asked for help multiple times. One dad actually said boys will be boys before getting shouted down by other parents. The board members looked overwhelmed and kept saying they couldn't comment on ongoing legal matters. The meeting went on for 3 hours, with people getting more heated as time went on. A woman named Aitana, who introduced herself as the juvenile probation officer assigned to the case, submitted a report to the court that Ruby somehow got details about. The report recommended strict conditions for Lamont, including mandatory counseling twice a week, electronic monitoring to ensure he stayed away from Sherry, and absolutely no contact through any means, including social media or third parties. Aitana had interviewed multiple people and reviewed all the evidence before concluding that Lamont posed a continued risk without intensive intervention. Her report took the situation seriously, in a way that felt like the first real acknowledgement of how bad things were. The hearing happened the next Thursday, and even though it was closed to the public, Ruby managed to piece together what happened from court records and people who were there. The judge extended the protective order for a full year and approved a diversion program for Lamont that meant he could avoid formal charges if he completed all the requirements. Sherry gave a victim impact statement that someone later told Ruby was incredibly powerful but heartbreaking to hear. She talked about how she couldn't sleep, had panic attacks in the hallways, and felt like she was punished for simply wanting to be left alone. The judge took her statement seriously and made it clear that any violation of the program requirements would result in immediate prosecution. That Friday afternoon, Lamont posted on Instagram for the first time since his arrest. It was clearly written by a lawyer with careful language that acknowledged he had caused harm while avoiding any actual legal admissions. He wrote that he was committed to learning and growing from this experience and apologized for any distress his actions may have caused. Comments were disabled, but screenshots immediately started circulating through group chats. Some people thought it was genuine, while others called it fake and manipulative. A few of Lamont's friends shared it with supportive captions, but most people stayed quiet about it. The next Monday morning, I noticed new signs posted on every locker bay, saying students needed written permission from the office to access any locker besides their own. Teachers stood in the hallways with clipboards checking locker numbers against student schedules, and maintenance workers installed security cameras pointing at the locker areas. The principal sent out an email explaining the new policy required staff signatures for any locker access, and students caught breaking into other lockers would face immediate suspension. I watched Sherry walk into school that same week with a completely different schedule printed on yellow paper, instead of the regular white ones everyone else had. She entered through the side door near the art room instead of the main entrance, and took routes through the building that avoided the spots where Lamont's friends usually hung out. Her seat assignments had changed too, and now she sat near the doors in every class with clear paths to the exits. Teachers seemed briefed on something because they never called on her unless she raised her hand first and let her leave class a few minutes early to avoid crowded hallways. Jane Winters pulled Sherry aside one afternoon and handed her a laminated card that apparently gave her permission to take tests in a private room and leave school for appointments without counting as absences. The accommodations seemed helpful, but watching Sherry navigate the building like she was dodging landmines made it clear how much damage had already been done. I deleted all the screenshots from my phone that week and unfollowed the accounts that kept posting updates about the situation, like it was some reality show. My friends asked why I wasn't participating in the group chat discussions anymore, but I just said I was tired of the drama. Ron texted me Thursday, asking if we could talk after school, and when we met up, he told me he'd started seeing a therapist twice a week. He said the sessions were helping him understand why he never questioned Lamont's behavior and how he'd ignored red flags because he wanted to believe his friend was just romantic. The therapist apparently asked him hard questions about male friendship and accountability that made him uncomfortable, but also made him think differently. Ruby posted flyers around school announcing a student panel about recognizing boundaries and consent, scheduled for the following Tuesday during lunch. Only about 30 kids showed up, but they actually paid attention as Ruby and 2 other students talked about the difference between persistence and harassment. They handed out cards with warning signs to watch for and resources for getting help if someone felt unsafe. 3 weeks after the court hearing, Sherry posted on Instagram again, with just 2 sentences thanking people who supported her and asking for privacy to focus on finishing the school year. She turned comments off immediately, but the post had over 200 likes within an hour from students who wanted to show support without bothering her directly. I spent that whole night thinking about how I'd called Lamont's flowers sweet and wished someone would notice me like that while Sherry was probably scared every time she opened her locker. The guilt sat heavy in my stomach as I remembered laughing when other girls said they were jealous of the attention she was getting. I started paying more attention after that and called out a guy in my math class who kept asking the same girl for her number after she'd already said no 3 times. News spread through school that Lamont had been removed from student council and the debate team with official letters sent to his parents explaining he could no longer hold leadership positions while on probation. Court documents that Ruby somehow accessed showed he had to attend counseling sessions twice a week and check in with his probation officer every Friday. His compliance reports indicated he was following the rules, but his counselor noted resistance to accepting full responsibility for his actions. The intense discussions that dominated every lunch period for weeks gradually faded to occasional mentions when someone saw Sherry in the hallway or heard updates about Lamont's probation status. Friend groups that used to sit together at lunch split into smaller clusters based on whether they thought Lamont deserved sympathy or consequences. Some kids still insisted he was just awkward about expressing feelings, while others said that excuse enabled dangerous behavior. The divide showed up in small ways, like people choosing different partners for group projects or avoiding certain tables in the cafeteria. Teachers tried to stay neutral, but you could tell which ones thought the whole thing was overblown and which ones took it seriously by how they handled discussions in class. The changes at the school felt both major and minor at the same time, with new policies and procedures mixed with the same old hallway dynamics. Sherry kept coming to the school every day with her modified schedule and safety accommodations, while other students slowly stopped staring at her every time she walked past. The whole situation became part of the school's background noise rather than the main event, but the effects rippled through everything from how teachers supervised hallways to how students talked about relationships. Looking back at those weeks after the hearing, I can see how the school tried to move forward while carrying the weight of what happened. Some changes stuck, like the locker policies and consent workshops, while others faded as people got distracted by prom planning and final exams. The social fractures remained, though, with certain friendships never quite recovering from the arguments about whether Lamont was victim or perpetrator. Even now, when I run into people from high school, they sometimes bring up that whole situation, and we all get quiet, remembering how wrong we were about what seemed like a sweet love story. 3 weeks after the hearing, I spotted Sherry sitting on the bench outside the art building with her sketchbook open on her lap. She had her earbuds in like always, but kept looking up every few seconds to scan the area around her. The school had given her this laminated card with safety protocols that she kept checking against her phone. She'd picked a spot with clear views of all the exits and positioned herself near the emergency call box. Her pencil moved across the page in quick strokes, but her body stayed tense and ready to move. I watched her pack up exactly 5 minutes before the bell rang and take the long route around the building instead of cutting through the crowded hallway. That same afternoon, I opened my laptop and typed out a message to Sherry that took me an hour to write, even though it was only 3 sentences. I told her I was sorry for treating Lamont's behavior like it was romantic when it was actually scary. I said I should have spoken up when things felt wrong instead of staying quiet. The last line said she didn't need to respond, because this wasn't about making myself feel better. I hit send and immediately closed Instagram so I wouldn't obsess over whether she read it. A month passed before the next big development, when 2 sophomore girls walked into Jane's office together, holding hands for support. They'd been dealing with an older student who wouldn't stop asking them out despite being told no multiple times. One girl showed Jane screenshots of dozens of messages sent over a single weekend. The other explained how he'd memorized their schedules and kept showing up wherever they went. Jane took their report seriously this time and immediately contacted their parents and the resource officer. The guy got called in that same day and received an official warning with documentation. Ruby published another article in the school paper tracking all the changes since Sherry's case became public. She listed the new anonymous reporting system that lets students file complaints online without going through Jane first. The article mentioned weekly check-ins now required for any student who filed a harassment report. Ruby interviewed 3 students who said they felt safer knowing the school was actually paying attention now. She also noted that reports had increased by 40% since the new system started. The numbers showed students were finally trusting the process enough to speak up. Ron surprised everyone by signing up for the peer education program about healthy relationships that the district started offering. He showed up to every training session with a notebook and asked tons of questions about consent and boundaries. The program coordinator said Ron was one of their most engaged participants. He started giving presentations to freshmen about recognizing when persistence becomes harassment. Ron would stand in front of these classes and admit he'd thought his best friend was just being romantic. He'd explain how he missed the warning signs because he bought into the same myths about love that everyone else did. The younger students listened to him more than they listened to the adults because he was honest about his mistakes. The counseling department announced they were hiring 2 new counselors, specifically trained in stalking and harassment cases. They converted an old storage room into a private meeting space where students could report issues without being seen entering Jane's main office. The new counselors started running support groups for students dealing with unwanted attention. They also created early intervention programs for students showing concerning behavior patterns before things escalated. The changes felt real when I saw kids actually using these resources instead of just suffering in silence. Sherry's grades started climbing back up once her accommodations kicked in properly. She could take tests in a quiet room without worrying about who might be watching her. Teachers gave her extensions when her anxiety made it hard to focus. Her art teacher submitted her portfolio to a state competition without telling her, and she ended up winning 3rd place. The recognition came with a scholarship offer for summer art programs at the local college. When they announced her name at the assembly, she actually smiled for the first time in months. Lamont's parents shocked everyone by publicly acknowledging their son's behavior and taking responsibility for missing the signs. They donated $10,000 to start a consent education fund at our school. His mom wrote a letter to the school board saying they should have recognized their son needed help when teachers kept forcing Sherry to work with him. His dad started attending the parent education sessions about recognizing problematic behavior in teenagers. They never made excuses or tried to minimize what Lamont did. Their accountability helped other parents realize they needed to pay closer attention to their own kids. I started noticing myself speaking up in conversations when friends said stuff that used to seem normal. When someone joked about wearing a girl down until she said yes, I'd point out how creepy that actually sounded. My friends would get defensive at first, but then usually admitted I had a point. These small corrections happened daily in hallways and lunch tables and group chats. Each time someone reconsidered their words, it felt like the culture was shifting just a little bit. Jane spent the whole spring developing new training modules for teachers and staff about the difference between normal teenage crushes and stalking behavior. She worked with experts to create specific warning signs to watch for in student interactions. The training included real scenarios from Sherry's case with her permission, showing how many red flags got missed. Every staff member had to complete the training and pass a test showing they understood the material. Jane presented the modules at a state education conference, and other schools started requesting copies. The program won an award for innovative approaches to student safety. By the end of the school year, these changes had become part of normal operations rather than special responses to one incident. Spring semester rolled around, and the whole vibe at the school felt different in ways that were hard to explain, but easy to notice. Kids actually stopped when they saw someone looking uncomfortable, instead of just walking by. The new reporting system got used regularly, and teachers took every complaint seriously now. I watched a sophomore girl tell a teacher about a senior who kept following her to her car, and within 10 minutes the school resource officer was walking that senior to the office. People started calling out creepy behavior in the hallways without worrying about being labeled a snitch. Sherry had applied to this art program at the community college that let advanced high school students take real college classes. She got accepted in February and started going there 3 afternoons a week instead of taking electives at our school. The college students there only knew her as the talented girl who could draw anything from memory. She posted pictures of her new art projects on Instagram, and you could see her relaxing in photos for the first time all year. Her shoulders weren't hunched up anymore, and she actually smiled in some shots. Ron and I ended up hanging out way more than either of us expected after everything that happened. We'd grab food after school and talk about how we'd both been blind to what was really going on with Lamont. He helped me recognize other times I'd stayed quiet when I should have spoken up. I pushed him to stop making excuses for guys in our friend group who said sketchy stuff about girls. We kept each other honest about our past mistakes without letting each other wallow in guilt. Sometimes we'd work on homework together, and the conversation would drift to how we wanted to be different in college. Lamont's counselor sent a letter to the court in March saying he'd completed his program requirements. The letter apparently included a full accountability statement where Lamont admitted to tracking Sherry and acknowledged the fear he'd caused her. His therapist wrote that Lamont was starting to understand how his actions were about control rather than love. The judge accepted the letter as part of his probation compliance. Nobody saw the actual letter except court officials, but knowing it existed felt like progress. Our school got picked for a state grant worth $50,000 to develop comprehensive consent education programs. The application Jane submitted included all the policy changes we'd made, plus statistics showing decreased harassment reports and increased help-seeking behavior. The state education department wanted to use our program as a model for other schools. Local news covered the grant announcement and interviewed Jane about how one student's courage to speak up created positive change for everyone. Ruby's investigative articles about the whole situation caught the attention of several journalism programs. She got scholarship offers from 3 different colleges, specifically mentioning her ethical reporting and ability to handle sensitive topics. Northwestern offered her a full ride to their journalism school. She told me she never expected her high school newspaper work to open doors like this, but she was proud she'd covered Sherry's story respectfully. Ruby decided on Northwestern and planned to focus on investigative reporting that actually helps people. Sherry started volunteering with the school counseling office to talk to younger students about recognizing red flags in relationships. She'd meet with freshmen and sophomores who requested help understanding if someone's behavior toward them was normal or concerning. She never mentioned her own story unless they asked directly, but she gave them tools to trust their instincts. I heard from teachers that her sessions were the most requested ones. Girls especially said Sherry made them feel like their discomfort was valid, even if other people dismissed it. My college applications were due in January, and I kept gravitating toward social work programs. Seeing how the system failed Sherry at first, but then adapted to protect her, made me want to be part of making those systems better. I wrote my main essay about learning to recognize my own complicity and wanting to help vulnerable people get the support they deserve. My counselor said it was one of the most honest application essays she'd ever read. I got into the State University's social work program with a partial scholarship. Graduation day arrived in early June with perfect weather and the football field packed with families. When they called Sherry's name to walk across the stage, the applause was noticeably louder and longer than for other students. She wore her cap decorated with paint splatters and held her diploma up high as she walked back to her seat. Her smile looked genuine and peaceful, rather than forced. People stood up as she passed their rows, and she nodded at them with real warmth. After the ceremony, I saw her taking pictures with her art teacher and the college professors who'd been mentoring her. Ron got selected to speak at freshman orientation in August about healthy relationships and respecting boundaries. He worked all summer on his presentation with the counseling staff to make sure he hit the right notes. On orientation day, he stood in front of 300 incoming freshmen and talked about how he'd ignored his friend's concerning behavior because it seemed romantic. He explained specific warning signs to watch for and emphasized that real love never involves fear or control. He told them about losing a friend, but gaining understanding of how to be a better person. The freshmen paid attention in a way they might not have if an adult gave the same speech. Several kids came up afterward to thank him for being honest about his mistakes. Senior year started without Lamont because his parents moved him to a district 40 minutes away as part of his court agreement. The hallways felt different without that tension hanging over everyone, and people stopped looking over their shoulders when they walked past Sherry's locker. I saw on his mom's Facebook that he was going to therapy 3 times a week and doing community service at a senior center on weekends. Jane Winters got invited to speak at a state education conference about the new policies our school put in place after everything happened. She brought copies of the reporting forms she designed and the training modules she created for teachers to recognize stalking behaviors. Other schools started calling her for advice, and within 6 months, our district's approach became the model for 3 neighboring counties. The local paper did a feature story about it with Jane's picture on the front page of the education section. She kept a framed copy in her office next to a thank you card from Sherry's parents. That spring, I helped organize a fundraiser for the women's shelter where Sherry had gotten counseling, and we raised almost $4,000 through car washes and bake sales. Ruby graduated with honors and got a full scholarship to Northwestern's journalism program after her portfolio included all her investigative pieces about our school's policy changes. She kept writing about campus safety issues, and her blog started getting thousands of views from students at other schools dealing with similar problems. The next fall, I started at State University and joined their peer counseling program, where I talked to freshmen about recognizing unhealthy relationship patterns. During winter break, I ran into Sherry at the grocery store, and she looked completely different. Not hiding in hoodies anymore, but wearing bright colors and her hair pulled back. She told me she was taking classes at the Art Institute downtown and had just gotten her first commission for a mural at a coffee shop. Her Instagram showed paintings and sketches, but also pictures with new friends from her program, people who knew her as an artist first. The school kept running the consent workshops every semester and made them mandatory for all students, not just freshmen. Teachers had to attend refresher training every year, and the reporting system stayed active with regular reviews. Ruby's articles caught the attention of state legislators, who started drafting a bill requiring all schools to have clear stalking policies and mandatory reporter training. She testified at a hearing wearing her Northwestern sweatshirt and speaking clearly about how one student's courage to speak up could create systemic change. I saw the live stream from my dorm room and texted her that she killed it. By sophomore year, I was leading workshops at local high schools through the advocacy group, telling my story about being a bystander who finally learned to speak up. Kids would ask questions about why I didn't say something sooner, and I'd be honest about thinking it was romantic instead of recognizing the red flags. One girl came up after a session crying because she realized her friend was going through something similar, and she'd been calling it cute. We connected her with the school counselor that same day. Sherry's art exhibition opened at a gallery near campus the summer after my junior year. The pieces weren't all dark or about trauma, but you could see themes of reclaiming space and finding voice through abstract colors and bold strokes. She stood by her biggest piece, a canvas covered in layers of paint that looked chaotic up close, but formed a phoenix from far away. People bought almost every piece, and she donated part of the proceeds to organizations that help stalking victims. I bought a small painting of a girl standing in an open doorway with light streaming in. She signed it with a note thanking me for eventually doing the right thing, even though it took time. Jane Winters retired that year, but not before training her replacement extensively on the protocols she'd developed. The new counselor kept Jane's systems in place and even expanded them to include online harassment policies. At Jane's retirement party, she gave a speech about how Sherry's bravery had transformed not just their school, but dozens of others. Someone recorded it, and it went viral on education Twitter, with teachers sharing their own stories of implementing similar changes. Ruby won a journalism award for her series on institutional responses to stalking and used the prize money to start a nonprofit focused on student journalism that holds schools accountable. She hired recent graduates to investigate and report on safety issues at schools across the state. Their first investigation led to policy changes at 12 different districts. Sherry sent me a message last month with a photo from her new apartment near the art school where she's finishing her degree. She's dating someone she met at a gallery opening who respects when she needs space and celebrates her independence. In the photo, she's laughing at something off camera, and she looks genuinely happy in a way I never saw during high school. The advocacy group asked me to write a piece for their newsletter about the long-term impact of speaking up, and I spent weeks trying to get the words right. Looking at everything that changed from that one Thursday morning when police walked Lamont out in handcuffs to now, it's hard to believe how wrong we all were about what love should look like. Appreciate you hanging out with me through all this. I've still got a ton of questions, but hey, that's just how my brain works. I'll see you around next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.
What's the grossest thing you've done for an A+? When Professor Clayton asked me to come to his house for dinner to discuss my final grade, I knew exactly what that meant. The guy had been staring at me all semester with those creepy divorced dad eyes, and now he wanted his shot. But I needed that A+ to graduate with honors and get into law school. I put on my shortest skirt and the push-up bra that made me look like I had actual cleavage. My roommate Sarah watched me get ready with her mouth hanging open. I told her it was just dinner to discuss my grade, but we both knew better. Professor Clayton was in his 40s with gray streaks in his beard and always wore those wool blazers that smelled like mothballs. He'd lean over my desk during exams and breathe on my neck while checking my work. The drive to his house took 20 minutes, and I spent the whole time practicing my excuse to leave early. I'd tell him my roommate was having a crisis or that I had food poisoning. Something believable but urgent. My hands were shaking when I rang the doorbell. A woman answered. Not just any woman, but a gorgeous blonde in yoga pants holding a dish towel. Behind her, I could see a normal living room with family photos on the walls and toys scattered on the carpet. "You must be Violet," she said with a huge smile. "Arthur's told us so much about you. Come in, come in." My brain couldn't process what was happening. This was Professor Clayton's wife. He had a wife. A hot wife who seemed genuinely happy to see me. I stood there in my hooker outfit feeling like the world's biggest idiot. Did these people want a three-way? "Arthur, Violet's here," she called out. Professor Clayton appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron that said "Kiss the Cook." He looked at my outfit and his eyebrows went up, but he didn't say anything gross. Instead, he shook my hand like we were at a business meeting. "Violet, thanks for coming. This is my wife Janet, and this is our son Andy." That's when I noticed the kid in the wheelchair by the TV. He looked about 17 with the same dark hair as his dad, but his body was twisted in ways that made it clear he couldn't control his muscles properly. An oxygen tank was attached to the back of his chair with tubes running to his nose. "Hi, Violet," Andy said. His speech was slow and took effort, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He was wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt that matched the one I had at home. We sat down for dinner and I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I still thought maybe they were swingers or wanted me to join some weird cult. But dinner was just normal pot roast and vegetables while they asked about my classes and career plans. Andy tried to ask me about the new Marvel movie, but talking seemed to exhaust him. Finally, over dessert, Professor Clayton cleared his throat. Here it comes, I thought. The weird proposition that would make sense of this whole night. "Violet, we invited you here because we need a favor," he said. "Andy's prom is next week and he doesn't have a date." I stared at him, then at Janet, then at Andy, who was looking at his plate like it was the most interesting thing in the world. "We know it's a lot to ask," Janet jumped in. "But Arthur said you wear superhero shirts to class and love the same movies Andy does. We thought maybe you'd consider it. Just as friends, of course." My face burned with shame. Here I was, dressed like I was going to work a street corner, and these people just wanted someone to take their disabled kid to prom. Professor Clayton must have mentioned me because I was one of the only students who'd be nice enough to say yes. "I'll pay for your dress and everything," Professor Clayton added quickly. "And dinner wherever you want to go." Andy finally looked up at me. "You don't have to," he said. I know it's weird. Something about the defeat in his voice made my chest tight. I thought about all the proms I'd gone to with my quarterback boyfriends, and how I'd taken it for granted that someone would always want to go with me. "I'd love to go with you," I heard myself say. The next week flew by. Janet took me dress shopping, and we found this gorgeous blue gown that covered everything my slutty outfit hadn't. Andy and I texted about Marvel theories, and he was actually funnier than most guys I knew. When prom night came, I felt weirdly excited. The dance itself was at a hotel ballroom downtown. Andy looked sharp in his tux, even sitting in the wheelchair. We slow danced with me kind of swaying while holding his hands. Other kids stared, but Andy didn't seem to notice or care. He was too busy explaining why Iron Man's arc reactor should have killed him with radiation poisoning. Around 10 o'clock, some kids from my economics class invited us to an after party. I almost said no, but Andy begged me to go. He'd never been to a real party before. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The party was at some rich kid's house with no parents home. I parked Andy by the pool and went to get us drinks. When I came back 5 minutes later, a group of football players were standing around him laughing. One of them was holding Andy's oxygen tube. That's when I saw Andy shaking violently in his chair and smelled the unmistakable scent of Mary Jane coming from his oxygen tank. I lunged forward and ripped the oxygen tube from Braxton's hand while Andy's face was turning purple. The tube hissed as clean air started flowing again, but Andy kept shaking bad. I screamed for someone to call 911 while the football players just stood there laughing like this was some big joke. Braxton was still holding his joint and grinning at me like he'd done something clever. I grabbed his Letterman jacket with both hands and shoved him backward as hard as I could. He went straight into the pool with a huge splash while I dropped to my knees next to Andy. The smoke was still hanging around his face, so I waved my hands trying to clear it away. His body kept jerking in these scary spasms, and his lips looked blue even in the pool lights. The other players backed away when they saw Braxton thrashing in the water. I kept one hand on Andy's shoulder to steady him while yelling that Braxton was going to jail for this. Someone must have actually called because I heard sirens getting closer. The paramedics rushed through the backyard gate with their equipment bags and went straight to Andy. They put a new oxygen mask on his face and checked his pulse while asking me what happened. I explained about the smoke in his oxygen line while they loaded him onto a stretcher. They moved fast but careful, keeping his head stable while wheeling him to the ambulance. I climbed in the back with them and held Andy's hand while one paramedic started an IV. My hands were shaking as I called Janet from my phone. She answered on the second ring, sounding happy until she heard my voice crack. I told her Andy was on the way to the hospital and something bad happened at the party. She said they'd meet us there and hung up. The paramedic kept checking Andy's oxygen levels and writing stuff on a clipboard. Andy's eyes were closed, but he squeezed my hand a little, which made me feel better. At the hospital, they rushed him straight through the emergency room doors while I had to stay in the waiting area. I paced back and forth in my blue prom dress, feeling sick to my stomach. Other people stared at me, but I didn't care. Professor Clayton and Janet burst through the doors about 10 minutes later, looking terrified. Janet ran straight to me and pulled me into this tight hug, even though I felt like this was all my fault. She kept asking if I was okay while Professor Clayton went to the desk demanding information about Andy. A police officer showed up and asked me to give a statement about what happened. I sat down with him in a corner and told him everything I could remember. I gave him Braxton's full name and described exactly how he was holding the oxygen tube when I found them. The officer wrote everything down and asked for other witness names. I listed every person I recognized from the party, even if I wasn't sure they saw what happened. My phone started going crazy with notifications from kids who were at the party. Someone had already posted a video that showed part of what happened by the pool. You could see Braxton standing over Andy's wheelchair and hear people laughing in the background. I screenshot everything before it could disappear, my fingers shaking as I saved each image and video. More messages kept coming in, some asking if Andy was okay, and others calling me dramatic. I ignored the mean ones and kept saving anything that looked like evidence. The officer gave me his card and said a detective would probably want to talk to me later. After what felt like forever, a nurse came out to talk to us. Her name tag said Gita Mercado, and she had this calm way of talking that made me feel less panicked. She explained that forcing pot smoke through Andy's oxygen line could have caused serious respiratory failure. His lungs were already weak, and the smoke could have shut down his breathing completely. She said I acted fast, which probably saved him from worse damage. Andy would need to stay for monitoring for at least 24 hours to make sure his oxygen levels stayed stable. Janet started crying with relief that he was going to be okay. We all sat in these uncomfortable plastic chairs while Professor Clayton filled out insurance paperwork. After a while, Janet asked if she could talk to me alone in the hallway. We found a quiet spot near the vending machines where she told me she'd had doubts about the party. She wanted Andy to have normal teenage experiences, but her gut told her it was a bad idea. Her voice cracked when she said she should have trusted her instincts. I told her this wasn't her fault at all. It was completely on Braxton and those other jerks. She hugged me again, and we both stood there crying a little. I excused myself to go to the bathroom where I locked myself in a stall and finally let everything hit me. Standing at the sink washing my face, I stared at myself in the mirror in this fancy prom dress. I thought about that first dinner at their house and why I really went. The shame of thinking Professor Clayton wanted to sleep with me felt so small now compared to what Andy went through. I promised myself right there that I would make this right for him no matter what it took. When I came back out, Sarah was waiting in the lobby looking worried. I'd texted her earlier and she'd driven straight there to pick me up. On the ride home, I told her everything that happened from the party to the hospital. She got so mad about what Braxton did that she had to pull over for a minute to calm down. She said she'd back me up completely if I wanted to file official reports or whatever I needed to do. Having her support made me feel stronger about what I knew I had to do next. The next morning, I walked into Assistant Principal Ross Cleary's office with my phone full of screenshots and videos from the party. His office smelled like old coffee and those pine tree air fresheners that never really work. He sat behind his desk looking uncomfortable before I even started talking. I laid out everything that happened at the party, showing him the videos people had posted. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead like he had a headache. "Look, Violet, boys will be boys," he said. "Maybe they were just being stupid teenagers who didn't think things through." My face got hot and I could feel my hands shaking. I told him they could have killed Andy by forcing smoke through his oxygen line. He shifted in his seat and said he'd look into it but suggested maybe Andy just couldn't handle being at a party. I left his office wanting to punch something. Back in my dorm, I pulled up Sailor Quinn's number since she was the one who hosted the party. She answered on the third ring and her voice got quiet when I told her who was calling. I asked if she saw what happened to Andy by the pool. There was a long pause before she admitted she did see Braxton holding the oxygen tube. She said she was horrified but scared to say anything because Braxton's friends would make her life hell. I told her Andy could have died and she started crying. She said she'd think about talking to someone official, but she was really scared. After we hung up, my phone started blowing up with notifications. Braxton's friends were posting about me online, calling me dramatic and saying Andy couldn't handle a little joke. They tagged me in memes about snitches getting stitches. Someone posted my dorm room number with a crying baby emoji before deleting it 5 minutes later. I screenshot everything before it disappeared. My roommate Sarah saw the posts and told me to be careful walking around campus alone. 3 days later, I drove to Andy's house to check on him. Janet let me in and led me to his room where he was propped up in bed with his laptop. He looked tired but smiled when he saw me. I sat in the chair next to his bed and asked how he was feeling. He told me his chest still hurt, and talking made him cough sometimes. Then he looked right at me and said he wanted to file charges against Braxton. His voice was steady, even though I could see how much effort it took to talk. "I'm tired of people thinking my disability makes me less than human," he said. We spent an hour going through everything that happened while I took notes. That night, Professor Clayton left me a voicemail that I played 3 times. His voice sounded strained, like he was holding back serious anger. He thanked me for protecting Andy, but warned me to be careful about the videos I'd been sharing. He said there were privacy laws that could get complicated if we weren't careful. He also mentioned that Braxton's family had money and connections. I could hear papers rustling in the background and Janet's voice asking him something. He ended by saying we needed to do this the right way to make sure it stuck. Finals were starting in a week, but I couldn't focus on studying. Instead, I sat at my desk writing out a detailed timeline of everything that happened at the party. I listed every person I could remember being there, what time things happened, who said what. My economics textbook sat unopened while I filled 3 pages with notes. Every detail mattered because I knew Braxton's side would try to twist the story. I wrote down what Andy was wearing, where exactly by the pool it happened, how long I was gone getting drinks. My hand cramped from writing so much, but I kept going. 2 days later, Detective Adam Coffey called me to set up an official interview. He had a deep voice and sounded like he was taking this seriously, which was more than Ross Cleary had done. We met at the campus police station where he asked me to go through everything again while he recorded it. He asked specific questions about who was holding what and when. He wanted to know if anyone else had videos or photos. I gave him all the screenshots I'd saved and the names of everyone I knew was there. He said he'd be interviewing other witnesses over the next few days. When I left the station, I felt like we were finally making real progress. That evening, Sailor texted me out of nowhere with a video file attached. She said she hadn't posted this one anywhere because it was too clear. I opened it and my stomach dropped. The video showed Braxton holding Andy's oxygen tube while another guy blew smoke directly into it. You could see Andy's face turning red and his body starting to shake. The timestamp showed it was taken right before I came back with the drinks. I immediately forwarded it to Detective Coffey with all the metadata intact. He replied within minutes saying this was exactly what they needed. A week later, Ross Cleary's secretary called to tell me there would be a disciplinary panel hearing. Word spread fast around campus that Braxton's parents had hired some expensive lawyer from the city. Suddenly, kids who were at the party started changing their stories. People who had told me they saw everything were now saying they didn't really see anything clearly. The guy who took the first video said his phone was too far away to show what really happened. Even some kids from my economics class who invited us to the party were backing away from getting involved. That same day, Janet sent me an email that made my chest tight. She thanked me for protecting Andy and standing up for him when it mattered. But she also asked if we could try to keep things low profile for Andy's sake. She was worried about him being known as the disabled kid who got attacked at a party for the rest of his life. She wanted him to have a normal college experience next year. I understood her concern but felt conflicted about staying quiet when Braxton was still walking around campus like nothing happened. The next morning, I stood outside Professor Clayton's office for 10 minutes before knocking because I needed that recommendation letter for law school, but everything felt weird now. He looked up from grading papers and motioned me to sit down while pushing his glasses up his nose. I explained that I needed the letter based only on my academic work and nothing else, and watched his face change as he understood what I meant. He nodded slowly and said he'd write it focusing on my test scores and class participation, and we both knew things between us would never be the same. 3 days later, Janet called me crying because Andy was back in the emergency room after waking up unable to catch his breath properly. I drove to the hospital still wearing my pajama pants and found them in the same waiting room as before. The doctor explained that Andy's lungs were still irritated from the smoke exposure, and any stress could trigger these episodes for months. Janet held my hand while we waited for test results, and I realized this wasn't just about one bad night anymore. The next week in my economics class, this guy named Tyler made some comment about me taking charity cases to prom for extra credit. I stood up in the middle of class and told him that making fun of disabled kids wasn't funny, and maybe he should focus on his failing grade instead. The professor had to call for a break, but afterward 3 other students came up to thank me for saying something. Tyler avoided me for the rest of the semester, which was fine by me since he smelled like gym socks anyway. Detective Coffey called that afternoon saying he'd gotten a judge to sign subpoenas for everyone's phones from the party. Within 2 days, he had 17 more videos, including ones showing faces clearly and audio of people laughing while it happened. He sent me copies of the court documents showing how many people had been recording and posting and deleting evidence afterward. The digital trail was way bigger than anyone thought, with some videos already shared hundreds of times before being taken down. Ross Cleary scheduled a meeting with me and Janet at his office where he suggested we could handle this quietly without courts. He proposed having Braxton write an apology letter and do 50 hours of community service at a disability center as punishment. Janet looked tired and said maybe that would be enough to avoid putting Andy through a trial, but I couldn't stay quiet. I told them that letting Braxton off easy just taught him that hurting people had no real consequences if your parents had money. Cleary shifted in his chair and said we should think about what was best for everyone involved, including the school's reputation. That night around 11, my phone buzzed with a text from Andy that made my hands shake. He wrote that he remembered more from that night, including Braxton leaning down and calling him a waste of oxygen right before everything went dark. He said Braxton told him nobody would care if he stopped breathing because he was already basically dead anyway. Andy said he hadn't told his parents yet because he didn't want to upset them more but needed someone to know. I screenshot the messages and added them to my folder of evidence while trying not to throw my phone at the wall. 2 days later, I was walking past the student union when Braxton appeared with 2 of his football buddies flanking him. He blocked my path and said his dad knew the district attorney and nothing was going to happen no matter what videos I had. He smirked and said I should focus on graduating instead of playing detective for some vegetable kid who couldn't take a joke. I kept my face calm and my hands steady as I pulled out my phone and started recording without him noticing. He kept talking about how his lawyer would destroy any case and how nobody cared about one weird kid getting pranked at a party. I let him finish, then walked away without saying anything while making sure the whole conversation was saved to my cloud storage. Professor Clayton caught me after class the next day and asked if we could talk privately in his office. He closed the door and stood by his desk looking uncomfortable as he apologized for putting me in such an awkward position with the dinner invitation. He said he realized how it must have looked to me, and that he should have been clearer about his intentions from the start. He rubbed his beard and said he felt terrible about the whole misunderstanding and wanted to make sure I knew he never meant anything inappropriate. I sat there for a minute, then decided to just tell him the truth about why I dressed that way for dinner. I explained how I thought he wanted something else, and had prepared myself to deal with it for my grade. His face turned red and he covered his eyes with his hand, while we both sat there cringing at how badly we'd both misread the situation. After a long silence, he said we should keep things strictly professional from now on, and I agreed immediately. He promised my recommendation letter would focus only on academics, and we shook hands like business partners sealing a deal. Later that week, Sailor found me in the library, and sat down looking nervous about something. She said she'd been thinking about testifying at the disciplinary hearing, but was scared of what Braxton's friends might do to her. I told her Detective Coffey could arrange for campus security to be present, and make sure she was protected from any retaliation. She bit her lip and said she'd do it if she could have someone with her for support during the testimony. We spent an hour going over what she remembered and writing it all down so she'd feel prepared when the time came. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning in the admin building, and I showed up early wearing my most serious outfit. The conference room had a long table with 5 panel members already seated, shuffling through papers and looking uncomfortable. Ross Cleary sat at one end, avoiding eye contact, while the others included 2 professors I recognized and 2 people from student affairs. They'd set up a laptop to show the videos and had printed copies of all the statements we'd submitted. Andy's written statement was on top of the pile, 3 pages typed by Janet since he couldn't hold a pen steady enough to write it himself. The panel chair started by reading it out loud, and I watched 2 of the members' faces change as they heard Andy describe being called a waste of oxygen before everything went dark. One professor put her hand over her mouth when the statement described how he woke up in the hospital, not knowing if he'd ever breathe normally again. They played the first video next, the one from Sailor's phone that showed Braxton holding the oxygen tube while smoke poured into Andy's mask. The room went completely silent except for Andy's recorded gasping sounds. Then they played the second video someone else had sent me, showing the football players laughing while Andy shook in his chair. The student affairs woman looked like she might throw up. Just as they were about to call the first witness, the door opened and a man in an expensive suit walked in carrying a briefcase. He introduced himself as Braxton's lawyer and immediately asked for the hearing to be postponed since there was an active criminal investigation. He argued the school shouldn't take action until the legal process played out, throwing around terms like due process and potential liability. The panel members looked at each other nervously, and Ross Cleary jumped on the suggestion like a lifeline. After 20 minutes of discussion, they voted to adjourn until the criminal case was resolved, which the lawyer said could take months. I left the building wanting to punch something. Detective Coffey called me that afternoon while I was stress-eating ice cream in my dorm. He explained that the district attorney's office had reviewed the case and Braxton would most likely face misdemeanor reckless endangerment charges, not felony assault like I'd hoped. The maximum penalty would be a year in jail, but more likely probation and community service. He said proving intent for felony charges was harder when alcohol was involved, and juries sometimes saw these things as pranks gone wrong. I hung up feeling defeated. That night I couldn't sleep, so I opened my laptop and went to our campus Reddit page. I created a throwaway account and typed out everything that had happened, from the prom to the hospital to the hearing getting postponed. I didn't use real names but gave enough details that people would know who I meant. Within an hour, the post had 50 comments, and by morning it was the top post with over 300. Half the comments supported Andy and called for justice, while others said I was overreacting to a harmless prank. But then people started sending me private messages saying they'd seen other incidents with the same football players. One girl said Braxton had dumped a kid's wheelchair off a ramp the previous year. Another person had video of him mocking a student with a speech impediment. The campus newspaper picked up the story, and suddenly parent Facebook groups were sharing it everywhere. Moms were posting about their own kids with disabilities and demanding the school take action. The local news called asking for interviews. Even some football players started speaking up, saying Braxton had crossed a line and didn't represent the team. A linebacker named Armand posted that his little brother had cerebral palsy, and what Braxton did was disgusting. 2 days later, the athletic director sent an email to all students announcing Braxton was suspended from the football team pending the outcome of the investigations. It wasn't enough, but at least it was something. His name came off the roster and his locker got cleared out. Some of his friends tried to start a petition to reinstate him, but it only got 12 signatures. The next week, Detective Coffey called with better news. The district attorney had filed formal charges, and Braxton had been arrested that morning. His parents posted bail within hours, but at least there was an official record now. The case would move forward, even if slowly. He had a court date set for next month and would have to enter a plea. Meanwhile, I still had finals to deal with. Professor Clayton had submitted my recommendation letter to the law schools without mentioning anything about Andy or the whole situation. He kept it strictly about my academic performance and research skills. I managed to get through my exams even though my brain kept wandering to everything that had happened. Somehow I maintained my grades, getting the A I needed in Clayton's class and passing everything else. 3 weeks after the first hearing, the disciplinary panel sent another email saying they were reconvening. Braxton's lawyer couldn't stop them this time since formal charges had been filed. The hearing lasted 2 hours with Sailor testifying about what she saw and 3 other witnesses confirming Braxton's involvement. The panel announced their decision that afternoon. Braxton was suspended for a full year and banned from all campus events including graduation. He'd have to complete 200 hours of disability awareness training before being considered for readmission. His parents threatened to sue, but their lawyer must have told them they didn't have a case. The best news came from Janet in a text saying Andy was finally feeling better and talking about maybe joining the Adaptive Debate Club next semester. He'd been so depressed after everything, but now he was making plans again, looking at the course catalog and asking about accessibility in different buildings. She said he even laughed at a Marvel meme I'd sent him, the first time he'd laughed since prom night. 2 weeks later, the school set up this mediation session, where Braxton had to apologize to Andy face-to-face. We all sat in this sterile conference room at the admin building with a mediator who kept checking her watch like she had somewhere better to be. Braxton showed up in a suit with his parents and their lawyer, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He read this prepared statement about how sorry he was for his actions, and how he understood the severity of what he'd done. His voice was flat, and he kept looking at his lawyer instead of Andy. Andy just sat there in his wheelchair listening, his face totally blank. When Braxton finished, the mediator asked if Andy wanted to respond, but he just shook his head. The whole thing took 20 minutes, and they made us sign papers saying the apology had been delivered. Janet gripped my hand so hard it hurt, while Professor Clayton's jaw stayed clenched the entire time. The lawyer made sure everything got documented and recorded, saying it would help with the criminal case. That night, we all met at Clayton's house to talk about what came next. Janet made pasta, and we sat around their dining table trying to figure out boundaries now that everything had gotten so complicated. Andy said he wanted me to stay in his life as a friend, that I was one of the few people who treated him normal. Professor Clayton cleared his throat and said he appreciated everything I'd done, but understood if I needed distance from their family. I told them I wasn't going anywhere, that Andy was my friend now, and that wasn't changing. We agreed I'd come over once a week to watch movies with Andy, and that Clayton would keep our professor-student relationship strictly professional. Sarah and I stayed up until 3 in the morning that night talking about everything. She'd been there through all of it, bringing me food when I forgot to eat during the hearings, and letting me cry on her shoulder when it got too heavy. She told me she was proud of me for standing up for Andy when it would have been easier to walk away. I admitted I'd learned more about myself this semester than in all my other years of college combined. She said watching me fight for Andy made her want to be braver too, to stop staying quiet when she saw wrong things happening. The next morning, I got an email from my top choice law school saying I was on the wait list. My grades were good enough, but they had limited spots and tons of qualified applicants. I spent the whole day writing an addendum to my application about how this experience with Andy showed me why I wanted to be a lawyer. I wrote about seeing how the system failed disabled people and how I wanted to help change that. I sent it off, hoping it would make a difference, but trying not to get my hopes up too much. 3 days later, the disability advocacy group on campus asked me to speak at their community forum. My hands shook as I stood at the podium in front of about 50 people, mostly parents and students with disabilities. I talked about what happened at the party and how important it was to step in when you see someone vulnerable being hurt. I explained how the football players thought Andy was less than human because of his wheelchair, and how that kind of thinking was dangerous. My voice cracked when I described finding Andy blue and shaking, but I pushed through. After I finished, a mom came up with tears in her eyes and thanked me for protecting someone's child when they couldn't be there. A guy in a wheelchair rolled up and said he wished more people understood that disabled doesn't mean worthless. The next week, Sailor found me after my economics final. She pulled me aside and thanked me for having her back during the investigation, when Braxton's friends were pressuring her to stay quiet. She said she'd been scared to lose her social standing, but watching me fight made her realize some things were more important than popularity. We exchanged numbers and she said she wanted to stay in touch, that we'd both been changed by what we saw that night. A few days later, Ross Cleary sent out an email to all students announcing new policies for school events. All chaperones would now need training on students' medical needs and emergency response procedures. Any student with medical equipment would have a designated safe zone at events where they couldn't be separated from their devices. It wasn't enough, but at least the school was admitting they'd failed to protect Andy. The policy changes would help future students, even if they came too late for him. Detective Coffey called the next week with news about Braxton's case. The district attorney had offered a plea deal and Braxton's lawyer had accepted. He'd get 2 years probation and 200 hours of community service specifically with disability organizations. He'd also have to do mandatory counseling about respecting vulnerable populations. Coffey said it wasn't prison time, but it was documented accountability that would follow Braxton forever. If he messed up during probation, he'd face real jail time. The judge had to approve it, but Coffey said that was basically guaranteed given the evidence. 2 months after everything started, Andy invited me over to watch the new Marvel show. We sat in his living room eating popcorn while he explained all the Easter eggs I was missing. There was no awkwardness anymore, just 2 friends hanging out and arguing about whether the show was better than the movies. Janet brought us cookies and Clayton waved from his study, but otherwise they left us alone. Andy laughed at my terrible theories about where the plot was going, and I helped him when his hands cramped up from holding the popcorn bowl. 3 months after that first dinner at Clayton's house, I was checking my email between classes when I saw it. The law school had accepted me off the waitlist for the fall semester. My addendum about Andy must have made the difference because they specifically mentioned my commitment to advocacy in the acceptance letter. I called Andy first and he cheered so loud his mom came running to check if he was okay. The next few weeks brought news about Braxton that I never expected to hear. Andy texted me one afternoon saying kids from his therapy group had seen Braxton at the disability center doing his community service hours. They said he was actually helping feed some of the younger kids and didn't seem angry about it anymore. Andy said we'd never be friends with him, but maybe the experience was teaching him something. I ran into Janet at the campus coffee shop a month later, and she told me she'd started volunteering with the disability advocacy group that formed after what happened. She was helping them push for better training for campus security and party monitors. We sat together for 20 minutes while she showed me the new policies they were proposing. She squeezed my hand before leaving and said having something positive to focus on was helping her process everything. Professor Clayton asked me to stay after class one day to discuss my senior thesis proposal. He marked up my draft with helpful notes and suggested 3 books that would strengthen my argument. There was no weirdness between us anymore, just a normal professor helping a student who wanted to learn. He even wrote me a second recommendation letter for a scholarship I was applying for. The professional boundaries were clear now, and somehow we'd turned that awful first dinner into something actually valuable. Andy called me screaming with excitement in April because he'd gotten his acceptance letter to our university. He was starting in the fall as a political science major, and already had meetings set up with the Disability Services Office about accommodations. He said watching the system fail him had made him want to fix it from the inside. His mom was already looking at accessible apartments near campus. I helped him register for classes, and we picked out 2 that we could take together. Sailor found me outside the library to tell me about the new organization she was starting. She'd gotten funding from student government to create a bystander intervention program for parties. She wanted students trained to spot dangerous situations and know how to step in safely. She said watching me fight for Andy had shown her that one person really could make a difference. The program already had 30 volunteers signed up for the first training session. She asked if I'd speak at their first meeting about recognizing medical emergencies. Finals came and went, and somehow I managed to keep my grades up despite everything. The day grades posted, I had my 3.9 GPA and the honors designation I'd worked so hard for. My acceptance to the district attorney's summer internship program came the same week. They specifically mentioned my experience with victim advocacy in the acceptance email. The internship coordinator said they needed people who understood why protecting vulnerable populations mattered. I'd spend the summer working on real cases and learning how the system actually worked. My graduation day was perfect May weather, and my parents drove up to watch me walk across the stage. Andy rolled up to the reception in his wheelchair that he'd covered in Marvel stickers and superhero decals. He'd added racing stripes down the sides and LED lights under the seat that pulsed different colors. He grabbed my hand and thanked me for seeing him as someone worth protecting, when everyone else just saw his chair. I told him he'd shown me what real strength looked like, and that our friendship was the best thing to come out of that whole mess. We took pictures together in our matching Spider-Man shirts that we'd planned weeks ago. Sarah helped me pack up my dorm room the next week, and we sorted through 4 years of college stuff. I found the outfit I'd worn to that first dinner at Clayton's house stuffed in the back of my closet. Sarah laughed when I held up the tiny skirt, and we both shook our heads at how wrong I'd been about everything. That dinner invitation that I thought would be my lowest point had actually changed my whole life. I'd gone there ready to do whatever it took for a grade and instead found a friend who needed help. Andy and I had plans to see the new Marvel movie next week before I started my internship. Janet was making dinner for all of us to celebrate my graduation and Andy's acceptance. Professor Clayton would be there too, probably wearing another mothball blazer and making dad jokes. The whole thing felt like family now in a way I never could have imagined that first night. Everything that happened after prom had been horrible, but it led to something better. I knew exactly what kind of lawyer I wanted to be now, and it had nothing to do with making money or winning cases. It was about making sure people like Andy had someone fighting for them when the system tried to look away. My law school orientation was in 3 months, and I already knew I'd focus on disability law and victim advocacy. The story that started with me dressing like I was headed to work a corner had turned into finding my actual purpose. Well, folks, that's it from me today. Thanks for sticking with me and letting me throw my thoughts and questions out there along the way. I really appreciate it. Like the video, it helps more than you think.